Welcome to Burning Platforms, our regular look at the politics of technology brought to you by Capita's Centre of the Public Square. I'm Peter Lewis. This week we talk with climate writer and activist Ketan Joshi about the opaque climate impacts of AI data centres. But first, our regular look at the latest tech news with panellists Digital Rights Watch Chair Lizzie O'Shea and Health Engine CEO Dan Stinton. Oh, well, let's kick off. This might be a historic Burning Platforms, the first tri-continental gathering of the clan. Dan Stinton, you're at home, aren't you? You're in Perth, or are you somewhere else in Australia?
No, I'm in Perth. That's right.
Okay,
one side of the
back where
continent.
you belong. Lizzie's in India. Hi, Lizzie. Thanks for getting up in whatever the time is in the middle of the day.
No, it's very civilised. Early afternoon. I'm enjoying myself. It's great to be here.
And joining us from Oslo, Norway, is Ketan Joshi, who we'll introduce properly when we dig into some of Ketan's amazing work around what I think is one of the great untold stories of AI, which is what the hell is its digital energy footprint. But thank you for joining us. What time is it over there, mate?
It's quite reasonable. It's 10 a.m. I actually woke up at 5:30 a.m. for another podcast, so
you're
I'm
just sharing yourself around.
My day.
But pretty busy for you with COP30 underway, I guess, as well, is it?
That's correct. Yeah, it's all COP stuff. So, but no, it's totally fine. I'm really happy to be with you guys, and thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, and really looking forward to getting to know what took you to Oslo, apart from probably the temperature, if you're focused on global warming, and also some of the work that you've been doing, particularly with the environment movement in Europe. But I thought, as always, we'll start off with our deep dive into the news. If I don't know if there's a theme this week, it feels like the March of Progress edition, in that we've got the platforms doing what they're doing, and then our government going all the way with AI. So maybe there's a little bit of a theme there that will land nicely on the impact on the climate and the environment of all this madness. So let's start off, Lizzie, with you. You've chosen new revelations that Meta's business model might be not quite as robust as it sometimes looks.
Yeah, so this is a report that's come from some documents internal to the company. Reuters, I think, is the one that broke the story, and then it's been reported elsewhere. But it's talking about how Meta knows about the amount of revenue that it's taking in from ads that are most likely coming from scammers. So they've done an analysis of this, and it looks like that in 2024, they projected that 10% of their revenue would come from ads for scams and banned goods. And that is a way in which they measure it. So they will ban some advertisers, but they have to give themselves a confidence of 95% that the account is a scam account. And so there are a lot of people who it looks like they're putting out scam ads below that 95% threshold, and the company knows that, is taking in this revenue. And this is obviously a big deal. That's a very large amount of money, so $7 billion by some estimates. And so a known source of revenue coming from essentially illegal activity by this company. And there's all sorts of things that flow from this, including a suggestion that they should be forced to hand over that revenue and it be put into redress schemes and the like for victims of scams, which makes sense to me. But for me also, there's this move to do things like ban notify apps or other kinds of technology that governments are looking at, including in Australia. And the difficulty, I think, is actually stopping advertising through social media platforms. And Meta has always said, we try and take those ads down. But it looks like they, in fact, know more about this than they care to share. And the reality is it's big bucks for them to continue taking this kind of revenue from ads for illegal products as well. So it does make me think that if governments want to ban certain kinds of products like AI notify apps, then they need to consider how they can hold the platform accountable for disseminating advertisements for those kinds of products, as well as companies that might be selling them directly. So, yeah, this may not be surprising to a lot of people who are tracking what is described as inauthentic activity on social media platforms, because there is a lot of controversy around how many platforms have accounts that aren't attached to real people and that are in fact able to be enlivened for all sorts of other activities, including generating mis and disinformation and the like. But this is a really interesting example of direct revenue coming in from what they know to be illegal behaviour. So, yeah, it does pose a bit of a challenge then to make sure regulators know who to direct their penalties and sanctions towards when trying to ban certain kinds of tech.
So, Lizzie, Australia's sun god Twiggy Forrest has taken Meta to court over the misuse of his images. Is there any sense that case is moving forward and that would have any impact on these sorts of strategies?
Yeah, there's a question around whether they can be held responsible for it. Under old rules, there's platforms are often treated as being like broadcast technology in the sense they're not responsible for the content that they broadcast, but there's a real question around whether those laws are fit for purpose now. And so traditionally companies social media platforms have not been held responsible for failing to moderate content that they know might be unlawful. So one of the things, this case that is going through the US court system with Andrew Forrest, is to determine whether that's true in a context of an ad using an image for a scam. I mean, this evidence is interesting from that perspective as well, because it appears to be very close to deliberate. If you have a 95% confidence that an account is purveying scam ads, I'm just not sure that's going to be looked upon fondly by a court in understanding how to interpret that kind of protection that has traditionally existed for social media companies. But it's very unclear. It's that's still got a long way to go. It's passed through one of the first hurdles, which is a good sign. But these court cases can take a long time. But it's an interesting example because obviously the image of someone famous used to sell a scam is something that should be able to be detectable by these kinds of companies, because the imagery can be more easily detected, say, than just text that might appear in scam ads. So I do think it's an interesting challenge to defend the position of using images of celebrities in scam ads and how they'll seek to do that if they'll be successful in front of a judge.
And Ketan, you've actually had a piece published, I think it was yesterday, in the New Republic, looking at how Meta is now using generative AI to turbocharge its advertising business. There seems to be a line between Lizzie's observations and where your story goes.
Yeah, there is, absolutely, because I think I found a lot of headlines when I was researching that piece about just the total, like the absolute value of money that Meta is making from its advertising business. And it's quite remarkable. When I use Meta's products like Facebook or Instagram, I get this vibe of decay. Like they kind of don't care that much about the platforms anymore. But then I see these headlines like Meta is raking in billions and billions, and it has a healthy advertising revenue. And I saw those headlines about the scam ads, and it makes a lot of sense because they're sort of not really willing to kill that off, right? Like it's kind of the one part of their business that looks good on there. Like you listen to the earnings call and Mark Zuckerberg is just full of enthusiasm and energy. Like he has this doubt about every other part of the business, but when it comes to the ads, they really feel like they're onto a good thing. And so obviously the company being loose about the way that it cracks down on scams has overlap with investing really heavily into this new technology to use generative AI to create videos and images for advertising, in that they don't care about the side effects. They want to keep this revenue line alive, and they are going to make decisions like this increasingly more and more to make sure that it stays alive. And I think there's a sense of anxiety around like, oh crap, what if we start losing the one thing that's making us money? And I think that it's worth noting as well, in particular, that there have been many applications for generative AI that are sort of misapplied. It gets crammed into a lot of different corners where it shouldn't. But when it comes to advertising, it sort of makes a weird sense in that advertising is generally not about like truth or accuracy or information retrieval. It's really just aesthetics.
Psychophancy.
Pure aesthetics. Yeah. It's pure aesthetics. And so I think that it makes a lot of sense. And it's just, it makes sense in a bad way, because it will probably work. And particularly, I think everybody's seen AI slop videos on like Sora or TikTok or whatever, and they're just they're weird, and you can't you can't immediately understand how that could make anyone money. But when it comes to this specific application, it might actually make them money. And so in the same way that they'll ignore a scam because it has side effects on human welfare, they'll ignore the environmental impacts of generative AI because they're just like, okay, if this helps our advertising business, we're going to do it. That's the impression that I get.
Dan, I feel you've got, I wouldn't call it a love-hate relationship, but as someone that used to work with the platforms for a good cause, getting people to read The Guardian and support The Guardian, watching this now, you must be so glad you're out of that game.
I wouldn't say that, but I just don't miss this part of it. That's for sure. This kind of thing has been going on for as long as there's been programmatic advertising. I mean, perhaps not turning a willful blind eye to it has not been going on that long. But yeah, I mean, in my time in publishing, not just at The Guardian, but even before that, if you were running programmatic ads, all of those ads are automated, right? No, it's not like there's a human there that's sort of approving the creative before it goes live. They're just going live and based on targeting. And so as a result of that, as a publisher, hopefully a responsible one, you're constantly playing whack-a-mole and trying to block ads and block the URL that hosts the ads and all those sorts of things. And, it was really difficult, actually. It was really difficult to do, mostly using Google's tech for that purpose. And they cared about it, or at least they cared about it more than Meta, and seemed to be at least providing the tools to us at the time to be able to actively remove those ads when we found them. Now, to be clear, at the time, I was arguing they should also be doing more, but they weren't deliberately sort of turning a blind eye to it, as has been revealed in this story. I think, picking up on what you said there, Ketan, I think where this goes next, when you start sort of fusing AI-driven ads and slop and the like into it, it's probably going to get an awful lot worse, and the ads are going to be an awful lot more believable and an awful lot more effective. And I think the reason
do you think effective, or is there a point of peak slop where it's no longer effective and it cannibalizes the full business model?
Well, I guess we'll find out. But I mean, you can say one thing about Zuckerberg: he's pretty good at knowing where that line is and how to turn a dollar. So I think he will probably he wouldn't let it go that far. I mean, people don't really care as much about advertising slop as they do about music slop, for example, or anything that involves a creative work. I mean, no one's standing up there and saying, "Oh, those poor advertising executives are having their work ripped off by AI." But a lot of people are saying that about music and everything else, right? So I think it's just a bad circumstance, because you've got a company that doesn't care. You've got a company which is enabling tools which is going to make the problem worse, and there's no real public outcry about it, because it's not like it's drawing on or stealing content that anyone really cares about. So I just can't see a solution. It's not a very optimistic take on this, but the only remedy for this, the only like foolproof remedy for this, is going to be that you effectively turn the whole programmatic advertising business upside down, and you have a circumstance where ads have to be approved, which wasn't that long ago, by the way, that was the case. I mean, we're talking 20 years, but it just seems like the genie's out of the bottle with that now. I mean, trying to get that through would be incredibly difficult to do. I'm not saying we shouldn't try, but it would be incredibly difficult. So I think that's the first thing. And as ever, some transparency around which of these ads are actually gaining the most prominence would also help, because it's impossible to find that out unless you do a full investigation like Reuters have done here. So that would also probably go some way to at least creating some outrage about the problem, which doesn't seem to exist now.
Yeah, I don't know, though. I think they are effective in the sense you don't need many people to click on the scam for it to work. Like, one of the things, like, everybody gets spam, right? And even though most people don't click on it, you don't need many people.
The law of averages.
Exactly. And with this kind of scam ad, you can target your audience. That's the benefit. You can actually avoid it being a broadcast message. You can actually zero in on people who are likely to click on scams. So I think that's what makes it more potent. I mean, the AI...
And you remember what Alex Brooks from Scam Victims was saying about the ultra targeting at the time of a scam, and then you're taking Ketan's research around the use of video. Like, the whole thing could become very, very potent.
Well, that's right. And the other thing that I took from our conversation with Alex Brooks is, when you're regulating for scams, you should go to the actor that has the most information. You should stop having this philosophy of user beware. You should go to actors in the ecosystem that can stop things. And social media platforms are one, banks are another, right? So you allocate responsibility in that way, instead of saying, oh, well, you've just got to be careful to not get spearfished. That's not really an option anymore.
Hey, let's move it along, Dan. you've chosen Apple's deal with Google AI. What's going on there?
Yeah, so lots of commentary about this over the last few days since I think it was Mark Gurman at Bloomberg who first broke this story. He breaks pretty much every significant Apple story. And apparently, according to Gurman, Apple is in final negotiations to license a version of Gemini, so Google's AI model, to help power the next version of Siri. So apparently the deal involves Apple paying about $1 billion a year to Google for this capability, which is kind of chump change and a bit of a rounding area for both companies, really. And it enables Apple, as I understand it, to continue to host the model on its own infrastructure, so Google won't really get direct access to Apple's user data as a result. So, look, the reason that Apple's doing this is probably obvious to anyone who's used Siri or attempted to use Siri over the last year. And it's pretty woeful, certainly compared to the voice-based capabilities of ChatGPT or Google Gemini. And the reason for that, this is slightly technical, I'm not going to pretend I understand, but I think the numbers will probably speak volumes. And that is Apple's current model uses 150 billion parameters, whereas Google's model that they're licensed uses 1.2 trillion parameters. Now, I'm sure Ketan's going to have lots to say about the environmental impact of that difference. We'll get to that. I'm not here to talk about that problem, though. I've got another problem. There's lots of problems, but I've got another problem with this one. So, look, I think the model's going to be better, and I think, on the plus side, this probably makes commercial sense for Apple and probably for Google too, because Google is going to get some insights from this that are going to make their model better, and Apple's going to get a Siri product which is actually workable and keeping up with its competitors, and so you're probably going to end up with a much better user experience, which is apparently launching towards the end of next year. But I hate it for a couple of reasons. But the main one is this is just sort of Mark II of the very cozy relationship between Apple and Google. So this started with Google's exclusivity deal on Apple's Safari browser. And because of that, Apple was earning billions and billions of dollars a year without actually having to invest in search. That was recently tested as being anti-competitive and found in favor of Google, so that deal can continue. But I think you just imagine a world where that wasn't able to be the case and wasn't able to be the case, say, 20 years ago or 15 years ago. Apple would have had a very compelling reason to go into search at that point, and maybe we would have wound up in a much more competitive search environment that we have rather than just one monopoly and Google controlling everything. So that's the first point. And this now just seems like the next version of that, because clearly there's now, Apple is saying that this is an interim solution and they're going to continue to invest in their model, but they're so far behind, I can't see them ever catching up. And I don't really see a motivation for them to either, because now they can basically have a product which is going to be able to keep up with their competitors without having to do any of the investment in that product. And therefore, it's really rapidly becoming a two-horse race now with AI models. It's really going to be ChatGPT and Google are the only two that are sort of left standing. Now, Claude is a third place one and is largely focused on business to business applications. And, we use that model and it's great on a lot of levels, but this effectively shuts Claude out from that deal as well. And that's the last point I'll say on this, and I'll let others get a word in it. Right. Apparently in the negotiations, Claude's model was actually better and more fit for purpose for what Apple was wanting to do. But Apple decided not to go with it because, one, it was going to cost them more money, and two, they had an existing commercial relationship with Google where they certainly learned how to play the market to both of their advantage. So it effectively ensures that Claude is never going to have a foot in the race, if that's the right term. So, yeah, I hate this for those reasons. I'm sure it's a good commercial decision, but it's a very anti-competitive one.
Why should I care? Like, it feels to me it's going to end up a world where AIs are like streaming services and people sort of choose and bounce around. If there's fewer, why do I care?
I just think it's way, way worse than that. But if it is like streaming services and we end up with half a dozen of them that people can swap really easily, then I'll be thrilled. I think what's more likely to happen is it's going to end up with probably a duopoly if we're lucky. Worst case, maybe ChatGPT takes the whole thing. And you've got to remember, these models are going to become increasingly capable to do things for you. They're already very useful. I know that comes at a huge cost. And again, we're going to talk about that in a second, I'm sure, Ketan, but they come at a huge cost, but they're very useful and they're only going to get better. They're going to be able to take actions on your behalf and really operate as your own personal assistant and many other things soon. And people will be tied into that system. And now you're going to be in a circumstance where it's effectively a duopoly. At least if Apple was investing in this or partnering with Claude, we might have three companies competing at a little bit more choice for consumers.
Do you care, Lizzie?
Yeah, I also hate this. I mean,
I hate it, but I hate all these rich companies marrying each other. I feel like they'll end up inbreeding, but you know.
Yeah, I don't think the products will get better. I think that this is a recipe. Like, if you were a market economist and committed to the market producing innovative solutions, this is bad because monopolies buy up competitors or crush them, build moats to protect themselves. So this is not going to be good for innovation or startup culture or whatever. This is just going to be one big company that does everything. And that does not mean that you necessarily get a better product if that's what you're interested in. It also makes it very hard to regulate super duper large companies because they, fines become a cost of doing business. They can lobby, all this kind of stuff. The exact kind of stuff we saw with the FANG companies in the last 15 years is going to be replicated at a more intense scale. I find it so frustrating. Like, I had a piece in the Baffler, if anyone's keen, talking about antitrust in the US, but it's so frustrating reading that decision about search. And the decision made by the judge to not break off Chrome, for example, because he said, oh, well, generative AI is going to be a competitor to search. So he essentially tinkered with the search products, but allowed those deals to continue. So the infrastructure is there for confirming that monopolistic structure when it comes to generative AI products, which is exactly what has just occurred. So you do wonder whether judges will continue to follow that line. There's plenty of other antitrust cases in the works in the US that may jeopardize some of the capabilities these companies have currently to dominate these markets. But it is immensely frustrating to see such, I think, a short-sighted decision in the search case come to fruition in such a precise manner. I mean, they're probably related. They may have been waiting for the ruling. So yeah, I just think it's very, like, we know from plenty of history that having a small number of companies dominate sophisticated industries, but that are very important to the economy and society and democracy is a problem. Like, I don't know why we would be careless about allowing this to occur now.
And Ketan, there's a extra, issue underneath the surface here, which Dan alluded to. Have you looked at this?
Yeah, I have a page on my website, which I created earlier this year. What I do is I collect up every sustainability report that gets released by a large tech company and some smaller ones too. And I collect up the emissions data and I collect up the energy consumption of the companies as well. And you can download all of that. That's all just like I basically translate it into a sort of format that you can download it and use it for things. So some journalists have used that and things like that. But probably the most interesting is relevant to this one is the energy consumption across different companies. And so Google, Meta, and Microsoft and Amazon are all basically similar in that not only has their energy consumption been going up, the rate at which the increase is occurring is accelerating. So every year they add more terawatt hours. That's not like a linear increase. They're getting less efficient, if that makes sense. So the amount by which the number of customers they have also goes up, and their revenue also goes up, but both nowhere near as fast as their energy consumption increases. And Apple is one of the only companies I've got on that list that does not have that relationship, or rather, it does not have that decoupling. Apple's revenue goes up, and their customer base goes up, and their energy consumption kind of goes up at roughly the same rate, which is what used to happen for all the companies. Like a decade ago, you look at the same numbers, and they of course, yeah, they were building new data centers, and they had other energy costs around like building and construction, and Apple had device manufacturing. But it was all relatively level-headed, and the numbers have gone a bit wild. Basically about 4 years ago, everything started going up and up, and Apple has remained a relatively normal company in that their energy consumption has been proportionate to the size of their business, and Google and Microsoft in particular are accelerating in their energy consumption. And so this is really fascinating because Apple, between the three companies, Apple, Google, and Microsoft, Apple is the one that seems to have the most sincere concern about taking real sort of, material actions on its environmental footprint. So it has like better supply chain initiatives. It has more like reasonable claims around reducing fossil fuel use and its energy consumption. I mean, they're all tech companies. None of them are perfect, but Apple is probably the least bad. And this is really fascinating, this news, because it will be interesting, first of all, to see what it does to their energy consumption. If it's a personal assistant type thing, it's probably not actually going to make a massive difference. But if it's something that they start baking into every single corner of your digital existence in Apple, like in the same way that you can't escape Microsoft Copilot, then I think it will actually start to make a material difference to their energy consumption. Apple got in a lot of trouble recently because they claimed to be selling carbon neutral watches. You could get these, you can get a sort of a watch that has, carbon offsets and renewable energy credits in their supply chain and that sort of thing. And so they're still smarting from that. They were successfully sued by a consumer in Germany. And so Apple, I think, are going to still care about their environmental narrative, the story that they tell, probably much more than Google and Microsoft will, who are both companies that are leaning a bit more into the right-wing conceptualization of energy technology. Like Google, for instance, is investing heavily in nuclear power and CCS and that sort of side of things. Microsoft are maybe not quite as bad, but Apple are sort of interestingly still dedicated. I think sometimes genuinely, sometimes not so much, but they still seem to care about the old way of thinking about climate. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how this happened, because you said it was running on it's going to be run on Apple's own infrastructure. Is that right?
That's my impression from the story. So I assume that's the case. Yeah. But it still feels to me like they may be outsourcing the environmental impact to Google here to some extent. But I guess we'll see.
And not wanting to stretch the limits of your understanding of this story, Dan, but the $1 billion seem, like you said, chump change. So this is more like an arranged marriage than actually a business transaction.
I mean, it's immaterial for both companies, right? So it is a very
just
small
a hookup.
And you have to wonder why there is a payment there at all. So again, it feels like a very back scratchy situation, right? If that's a term, where Google are doing this because they want the insights from the hundreds of millions or billions of users of Apple users around the world, and Apple are doing this so that they don't have to make the investment into their own models. And sure, we better pay $1 billion in case someone from an antitrust judge looks at this at some stage in the future. But I mean, it just feels like collusion to me.
Mm.
They could also be planning revenue. They could also be planning revenue sharing from advertising in future, for example, which is what Search currently does for them, and placement of the app. I mean, maybe that's too sophisticated at this point, but that's the other source of money changing hands, or revenue sharing arrangement from advertising.
Let's change it up before we go back and dig deeper into the whole energy discussion, which is why Ketan's here. I just wanted to put on the table a story that our friend Cam Wilson put up on Crikey today, but I'll get there via an announcement from the government. So we're all waiting with bated breath to see what the government comes up with in terms of its AI action plan, which I think is out in the next month. I was chairing a discussion with the minister last night, and I must say I'm not filled with a whole lot of excitement about where it's going to go, but I think we've now got a fair idea of the government's enthusiasm to really get cracking with these tools, with today's announcement by the Finance Minister, Katie Gallagher, that the government's launching its own internal government bot. What do we know about it? They're saying it's going to be designed for purpose, drawing on government data. So it's not just sort of like a large language model plus data that the government's feeding in behind some sorts of protections. Okay to use commercial AI tools to up to the official security classification. They're avoiding locking in a single commercial vendor, and there's compulsory engagement with staff and their unions, which is obviously a good thing. It seems most of the people that look at these frameworks think this is a pretty positive path. I think I haven't spoken to Nick about it, but I saw some other commentary. Secure onshore generative AI platforms, mandatory AI impact assessments, and some sort of supplier obligations, which I assume is the models, the suppliers declaring and taking responsibility for their AI use. So that's all the way with AI in the public sector. But then I thought, well, Cam's piece was an absolute cracker today in Crikey. He FOI'd the prompts at the head of national security at the Department of Home Affairs had made to his Microsoft Copilot. He asked it to help research a speech to a think tank, serve up some metaphors and draft messages to staff. And there's a few, it's not exactly a gotcha, but it is revealing in a number of ways. First, the degree to which senior government bureaucrats are integrating AI into their work now. Worth noting that in this week's Essential Report, we have 30% of all workers and 50% of those under 35 using AI in their work. And while a little bit, like on one level mundane, an example of how young graduates are being AI'd out of drafting speeches, which I would imagine be quite interesting learning work for them. Also, I think the other interesting piece is, thanks to Cam, that sort of opens up a new layer of scrutiny for decision-making. It's almost a digital paper trail of a decision-making process, or at least a speech-writing process. So I don't know what you other guys made of that, but kudos again for Cam for using all the tools in a reporter's kit bag to get this story up. But I just think it talks to a culture, and I think for some of us in the digital rights space, we're kind of waiting for the government to come up with quite a nuanced strategy to not contain the technology, but to set the right frameworks. And I'm just not confident. What do you reckon, Lizzie?
Well, the other initiative that's underway is developing a national AI sovereignty capability plan. Kind of, that's due by the end of the year. So this strikes me as more in that vein than, say, a comprehensive approach to regulation of AI or minimum standards. I mean, I don't know what
this is just how government's going to use it, basically. Which is a lot.
Presumably, like, if you developed tools or you wanted to allow for a culture of generation of tech alternatives or whatever, or you wanted procurement to be part of a strategy for diversifying the marketplace, that is one way in which you express your capability as a sovereign nation and don't become dependent on different, a specific tech stack. So there's opportunities there, I think, to do good stuff in procurement and focus on capabilities. But I don't know. I'm not confident that we're going to get there, because I feel like the approach to regulation was so it was pretty lacking in bravery. I don't know. We've now got this sort of AI safety standard sitting there with no real requirement to comply. Government is procuring from OpenAI, and that's not, by my read, compliant with the standard, for example. So is there going to be, what is the meaning of that standard? Why would companies seek to comply with it if government might not be? Do you know what I mean? Like, there's mixed messages coming out of government, I suppose, is my point. And so I like the basics of this, as in, I think there could have been worse ways to do this than this particular activity. But I also remain a bit concerned that the overarching strategy is not where I'd like it to be. And I'd be curious to see how this shakes down in this particular program of work or procurement.
Dan, have you got a problem with any of this, or it's pretty much a good model?
I love this. I mean, you can all tell me why I'm wrong, but I think it's this is what the government should be doing. It is these tools are really useful. They do drive productivity if done well. I like the fact that the government is trying to put some guardrails around it rather than just letting their staff go and use the overseas models and have all the data go overseas. It is, in my view, I mean, with a bit of trial and error, going to result in substantial productivity gains in time. This is exactly what I would want to see the government doing. I think it is absolutely a step in the right direction. I mean, I'm not taking anything away from Cam's reporting, by the way, which is sort of a separate issue.
And it doesn't undermine the framework. It was just congruent today.
Yeah. But I mean, look, the reality is that everybody, I mean, certainly 100% of my workforce is using AI every day, 100%. And I think that's going to be most companies soon. So you're better off putting some guardrails in it and trying to leverage the good rather than just not having anything and letting it run rampant and letting everything go to the overseas models without any guardrails. I think this is a really welcome step in the right direction.
Ketan, genie out of bottle.
Something that really fascinates me in that is the whole idea of having a language model that's trained on a narrow data set, or like a package of documents and information and data that is small, and the way that differs from uploading a PDF into Google Notebook or whatever, and then asking questions about that PDF. and I've done both. Like there's a thing called Chat IPCC, which is a language model based on the IPCC reports, which are thousands and thousands of pages long, tens of thousands of pages when you start counting multiple IPCC reports. And I test it. I find stuff that I know, and I ask questions like, tell me about this particular thing. And it is actually pretty good. I'm testing it because I want to find failures, right? Like I want to make fun of it or criticize it, and then it kind of performs, and I'm like, oh damn it, it actually works. But then I do the same thing with ChatGPT or Google Gemini, and it is way more flimsy, right? Like even though technically the same documents are part of the same information system for ChatGPT, right? Like it has the IPCC reports somewhere in the billions and trillions of parameters in there. But when you start asking the same questions, you get absolute garbage answers that botch it and get the numbers wrong and get the facts wrong and deliver it all in a confident tone. And so that's really significant, that difference. And I really like the idea of using language models for narrow data sets. I do a lot of information retrieval and things like that. And I find that it's surprisingly reliable. The other thing that's worth mentioning as well is that there was a note in there about like mandatory AI impact assessments and declarations from suppliers and things like that. You can add sustainability and energy information in there really easily, and it's not going to be too massive, right? It would be something in the same lines of like, when you sign up for a video calling service provider for government, you can say, okay, well, tell me what your energy consumption was. And it can just be like a nice normal thing like we used to do. Whereas if you get Copilot, you will not get a good level of information about the environmental impacts.
Just one last quick point, if I could, Peter. Sorry to jump in. What you've just touched on there, Ketan, with using limited data sets, it really resonates with me because we're building AI products in our workforce, and one of the guardrails you put around it to make sure that it doesn't hallucinate and it doesn't go and do crazy things is you just limit the data set that it's able to access, right? And therefore you're really controlling the information. I mean, the analogy that people often use is that, designing products using AI is more like growing rather than building, and so or training. So it's kind of like you've got a puppy and you've got to put all your fencing around your gardens, or your puppy's going to destroy the garden. But if you put the fencing up, you can have a good puppy. That's probably a really bad analogy, but hopefully
where does it shit?
Well, that's another problem. Although that's another point. To continue with that analogy, it will shit less if there is less data that it's using because it will with less environmental impact. So anyway, I think this is one of the lessons is that you can deploy AI in a much more responsible way if you do put guardrails and limit the information that is being used to train it.
And look, just to round it out, fair, like the government didn't redact the FOI as well, which I think is a positive step. I think if it had been full of, we're not to tell you what the prompts, it sort of leads to greater suspicion as well. Anyway, let's move on into our deep dive with Ketan. I didn't introduce you properly. You're kind of, I don't know how to describe you on your profile, climate writer, activist and advocate. You're an everyman. You're a bon vivant. You're, I don't know if you're too old to be an influencer. But I invited you on after you responded to a post I wrote on LinkedIn bemoaning the lack of proper analysis of the energy footprint of AI data. And I have been really frustrated. Whenever I talk about this, I'm told by people in the environment movement it's a bit overblown, or from tech that the AI will sort itself out. So when I heard Matt Bevan's piece on ABC, which is for a very general audience, I thought he gave it a really good crack, but I was looking for more. And I had a bit of a vent, and you responded with an amazing set of links to some of the work you've been doing, which I'm ashamed to say I wasn't totally aware of, although I've seen your work out of the corner of my eye. So before we go into your work, tell us a bit about what you're doing sitting in a room in Oslo.
Yeah. We moved here in 2019. My partner is in the media and communications department at the University of Oslo. She's an associate professor there now. And yeah, we sort of, when you're a humanities PhD, it's not easy to get jobs in Australia. And we kind of thought we'll move somewhere else in the world. And we had a kid at the same time that we moved, and we discovered as soon as we moved here that Norway is a fantastic place to have kids. There is great government support.
Have a kid move to Scandinavia.
Yeah, we liked it so much we had a second kid, and it's just really, it's a lovely place to have kids. bloody freezing, but I can handle the darkness, I can handle the cold, but the ice season will be beginning soon in a few weeks, and the icy ground is not something I can handle at all, but everything else is great.
So instead, you spend your time building out spreadsheets of
Inside,
the footprint.
yes.
So let's cut to the chase. What do we know and what don't we know about the environmental impact of this technology?
Yeah, great. That's a good question. So the important thing about that question is that it's framed around absence of knowledge as well as knowledge. There's a lot of gaps in this area, but I can break it down into a few really straightforward categories pretty quickly. The first is that there is an environmental footprint for building infrastructure. So to manufacture a chip, like an NVIDIA GPU, contains chips, and those chips require energy-intensive manufacturing processes, particularly in Southeast Asia. So it takes a bit of fossil fuels to make stuff. It's the same for everything. It takes fossil fuels to make wind turbines and EVs as well. You also require emissions intensive process to build the infrastructure itself. So you've got cooling systems and concrete and steel to have the building that the computers are in, and to cool them down so that they operate well. And then when that data center draws electrical energy, can either do it from the power grid, and anytime you increase demand on a power grid, you'll have an increase in generation, and a lot of that times that increase in generation will come from coal or gas. Even in grids with a high penetration of hydro, nuclear, wind, and solar, there is often still some level of fossil fuel, so the net effect will almost always be some increase in emissions. Or the data center operator can just build their own power station. And this is happening more and more, and I've been tracking it more and more. There are many good examples of this, but the two most prominent, one is the data center that runs the XAI Grok generative AI system. And that facility has been built with 38, if I remember the number correctly, fossil gas turbines all attached on the outside, highly visible. And a mate of mine, Sharon Wilson, has filmed the methane leaking from those gas turbines. It's quite remarkable. Meta is building a 2 gigawatt data center that also comes with its own new fossil gas power station in Louisiana in the US. This is the more stark and more clear example of where the new power demand induces new fossil fuels, because it's not this sort of mixed up effect on the power grid. They're just building their own gas-fired power stations, and there's no argument about the impact of that. It's really straightforward. And so those are the two main ways that more power demand results in more emissions or more environmental impact. And then the other segment of this whole issue is whether or not generative AI itself is having an impact on rising power demand. And so this is where it starts to get fuzzier. This is more into the we don't know part of your question. What we do know, as I mentioned before, I've been collecting up energy disclosures from big tech companies, and I mentioned that their energy consumption is rising really, really fast and unusually fast. We also know that power demand on grids is also rising faster than it has in the past. And so this, particularly in the United States and particularly in regions where there's a lot of data center development. What we do not know is when Google says, we consumed 2 more terawatt hours this year than we did last year, what proportion of that is chatbot responses? What proportion is generating images and videos? What proportion is like video calls and Google Docs and basic infrastructure and more customers using more services? They do not disclose any of that information. So we have to infer from secondary information that the rising power consumption is probably related to these generative AI systems, which we know consume a fairly decent amount of electrical energy, because the computations required for inference that's responding to inquiries or for training the systems themselves is pretty high. And so, yeah, that's
the other unknown is that their take up, because it's still relatively in its infancy. So a lot of the charts I see stop at 2030, but it's sort of looking like you're on an upward thing and it stops there. But I'm imagining you're looking at an exponential chart if the boomers get their way.
Yeah, look, I mean, there's some really good studies. There's an IEA report that came out a few months ago, and then before that, there's been some other compilations. What these studies do is they compile every single forecast, and they just plonk it all into one chart, and you can just see this bloom of potential futures for energy consumption for data centers around the world, and the difference between the highest and the lowest is absurd. It's just such a huge, some of the projections of data center power consumption are used to justify new fossil fuel infrastructure like gas pipelines and power stations. But even the lowest of those project a very significant increase in data center growth. And so that's important, right? Like that tells us that even the lowest, we have to get ready for a massive influx of new power demand from these systems. And then the second thing I wanted to mention as well is basically the underlying philosophy behind why generative AI deployment and why power consumption is increasing so significantly. I can't really write about this or analyze this without engaging with the products themselves, right? Like, why do people use ChatGPT? Why do people use generative images and videos? And so something I've really noticed is that there is a widespread effort to manufacture demand for the product. And so in the way that Google has an AI overview, whether you request it or not, when I search for a word in my WhatsApp messages that's like, Wi-Fi password or something, I get like a whole bunch of generative AI prompts. When I'm, when I open a PDF in Adobe, I get like a lot of prompts to try to summarize it with generative AI. And so there's basically a broader effort to install generative engagements, whether people request them or not. And so I think that has been a major contributor to the rising power demand. And I liken it to the way single-use plastic was introduced in supermarkets. So, you can't buy a tub of yogurt without buying this like petrochemical shell that is going to last 20,000 years. You have no choice. You maybe there's like, you can find some supermarket that lets you bring your own tub and put your own yogurt in there. But the petrochemical industry understood in the 70s and 80s that having excessive demand for plastic, and particularly single-use plastic, was a really important part in maintaining fossil fuel use and having a basically a side project for revenue. The other example I liken it to is large SUVs. So car manufacturers have been making cars bigger and bigger, and a lot of people complain about not being able to buy a small car anymore, even though they kind of want to. They don't really enjoy driving through a supermarket car park and scraping the edge of their car because their car is like, way too big and the supermarket was built 20 years ago. No one is particularly chuffed about having ever enlarging vehicles. But the fossil fuel industry recognized that it's a good lifeline to have more energy hungry cars. And the car manufacturers make more of a profit when they sell a car that is bigger. So they have a higher profit margin. And it's this really similar thing where there's sort of a confluence of the fossil fuel industry's interests and then a sort of a different sector's interests in stimulating demand by having unavoidable excessive deployment. So I think, all three of you would have seen examples where you've seen like generative AI being used where you're just like, this is ridiculous. Like, why is this here? It makes no sense. It makes more sense to have like a narrower, more level-headed deployment, that's better suited for specific tasks. But my argument is essentially, because of the mixed interests here, the fossil fuel industry loves it when power demand is going up crazily on power grids, because the existing coal and gas generators get to burn more fuels, and new facilities are justified because it's like, well, demand is going up. And the net result is that you see rising emissions, not because of anything inherently wrong or bad about a large language model, but because of the dynamics of the companies involved. And so what you can also find is many, many examples, and you might see some today because the International Energy Agency just released their World Energy Outlook, where you'll see a fossil fuel company or an advocate or a lobby group or a government aligned with fossil fuels just standing up and saying, well, I'm sorry, but because of all these data centers, we kind of have to sideline these climate concerns and worry more about meeting power demand in the short term. And yeah,
Hey,
that's
Ketan.
yeah.
So, I mean, I share your concerns. Obviously, the demand on energy is going up exponentially, and the green power is not keeping up. And so, I'm completely convinced by your argument. I am interested in that there does seem to be some companies who are also trying to do the right thing, which perhaps we can come back to. But I just want to challenge one thing that you said there, which is sort of where this is coming from. I mean, it strikes me that the reason you're seeing those silly Gemini summaries on the top of SERP pages is because, or search results pages, is because we're kind of in this trial and error phase of the tech, right? Like everyone's trying to figure out where to put it and what to do with it. And so, yeah, a lot of the things that are being trialed are kind of silly, and we'll probably look back in 10 years, maybe even 5 years, and go, well, that was kind of nuts. But I mean, I'm not saying there's not a massive environmental impact on this. I think there is, but isn't the main driver for this is because the hyperscalers and also lots of other companies which are building wrappers on top of the models are just trying to figure out new business models and new applications that are useful?
I don't know. It's the interesting thing that I've seen is that first of all, options to disable these sorts of additions tend not to exist, right? So they're not really. It's definitely something that they want to bake into the system, right? Like that's the feeling I get. I'm certainly not an expert on like UX design and like the way search has been designed and things like that. But I'm a writer. And I work with a lot of media outlets and publications who are suffering pretty badly from having essentially what will happen. And there's actually a tourism company here in Norway who had to basically stop publishing tourism guides because what was happening is the content of their guide was being auto summarized as the first at the top of a Google search results page, and nobody was clicking on the actual guide and then following through on their website onto signing up to tours and stuff like that. I just mentioned that as an example of where Google might see that and think, okay, this is having a toxic effect on the sorts of type of way that we want the internet to be, or we don't think this is a good application. But I don't think Google is ever going to take away the Google AI overview. If anything, I suspect they'll double and triple down. And I should just be clear about another thing. I don't think that Google is in like cahoots with like ExxonMobil or anything yet. But this is but this is certainly like the plastics industry of the 1970s and 80s in that there's confluences of interest, right? And so they sort of like Google does not have anything in their sustainability report about, oh, okay, well, we're kind of in like a testing phase. We're just kind of seeing what works and what doesn't work, but our aim is to reduce our energy consumption overall in the next 5 years. You won't find anything like that in there because they don't consider reducing the total energy consumption to be a priority. So that's I don't share your optimism for the potential for this to kind of shake out into a better situation over the next in coming years. I think that they're not really well incentivized to go, oh, okay, well, let's push for a more efficient deployment and more like sensical deployment. Even though there are, and you meant just other part of your question, you mentioned like who's doing it well, who's kind of thinking about it in the right way. And there are companies who are sort of going, okay, well, and maybe I think Salesforce is a nice example of this. They think about efficiency in the sense that they do not want to be building 1 million new data centers, angering communities and getting a lot of bad press. They're not into that at all, right? Like they actually want to deploy their large language models in a way that seems to be making sense for now. I don't trust any company by default, but they care about efficiency, right? Like, and they contribute to open source efforts to have more efficient models and have lower overall power consumption. And again, you can see that reflected in the actual numbers that they disclose, which you can see on my website, right? Like they're not seeing that crazy, even though they have actually been very explicit about investing in large language models. You just don't see that crazy explosion of energy consumption. And I think it reflects the thinking or the philosophy behind how they're doing it, right? Like they're like, okay, yes, we want this, but we're going to set some boundaries and some limitations around how we deploy it. I think that's a good thing. Yeah.
Hey, Katana, I just wanted to ask you a couple of questions about Australia, though. So, like, that's a very helpful, I think, grounding in where some of these large companies are going. One of the things I am concerned about in Australia, though, is where we're seen as a potential place in which it's good to build data centers because we're an ally of the United States. A lot of these companies are based in the United States. We've got, quote unquote, an abundance of natural resources that are necessary for building data centers, for example. And there are examples in the US of building data centers with that community involvement for, in various places and resistance at that kind of local level. But we're not seeing a huge amount of activity in that respect here. I mean, some of it is it's maybe the wrong time of the life cycle of this industry, but like there was a report done which talked about, for example, the efficiency of introducing large data centers as compared to on-site storage. So like there are some arguments that are put that there's a benefit for overall efficiencies. I wondered if you had thoughts on that. And then it seems like it's then projected as being a place, an industry that creates jobs and economic activity, and this is why we should lean into it. And I wondered if you had any kind of thoughts about that, or how Australia should be positioning itself. The other thing I should say is the industry talks a lot about how many providers have committed to using 100% renewable, which is not the same as actually using, of course, but that's the kind of industry hype I'm seeing, at least from where I'm sitting.
Yeah. You have to be really careful to split out the claims at a company level to the systemic effects on a power grid. And Australia is a really good example of where, in a situation where you have the energy transition continuing at pace, there are new wind farms and there are new solar farms and new batteries. They're being built not as fast as they should be, but still they're being built relatively fast, and particularly on a global scale, like Australia does really well with solar. However, what we see in power grids that are sort of partway through the energy transition, but still have a substantial amount of fossil fuels on the grid, like Australia has still, a lot of coal. It's still sort of 55 to 60% coal powered. What happens is the new renewables end up serving new power demand instead of cutting downwards onto fossil fuel output. And so you end up with a situation where things could be worse, like at least we're not building new coal and gas to meet new power demand. But you are also not seeing emissions fall anywhere near as fast as they should. And that can end up as a stagnant and systemic problem. Texas is another really good example of this, where there's a very large amount of wind and solar being built, but demand is rising so fast and so unusually fast that gas simply stays in Texas's grid. And every year, there's actually been an increase in emissions in Texas. This is really, really important. And it's important for a bunch of different reasons. So first of all, something that has happened in the climate and environment space, and Peter, maybe this speaks to what you mentioned before as your experience, that people are kind of shrugging it off as not that big of an issue, is that you can have an effect where you get lots of nice looking records for renewable energy, right? Like, oh, we built more wind farms or more solar this quarter than we ever have, or whatever. And that sounds good and it sounds reassuring. But when you look at the power grid, that new generation is being plonked on top of the fossil fuels that currently exist. Whereas to solve climate change, you have to get rid of the fossil fuels. And so I think it's really important to bring it always back to not just the positive story of renewables, which is important, but also the story of getting rid of coal and gas. And also down to the company level, Lizzie, you mentioned the claims around 100% renewable energy. I will not go into it in any detail, even though I could talk for 10 hours about this. But the idea of a company claiming that they're using a particular type of energy source is really, really important. And Australia has been developing new ways for a company to report the types of energy that it is claiming, government not mandated, but government sort of sponsored ways of claiming a certificate. Like, I did a deal with a new wind farm that just got built for my data center, and I'm going to claim 100% of the energy from that wind farm and say that I'm zero emissions. This is something that is a really, really important debate and does not get anywhere near enough attention, mostly because Australia will have a material amount of data center development over the next decade or so, right? Like, this is the energy market operators' forecasts have all been updated. really substantial amounts of data center development. They actually created an entirely new category for it in the last update because it's such a major new industrial load. There's one other thing to mention here, which is that demand growth on power grids is inevitable. There is just no getting away from the fact that if you start electrifying all the cars, you start electrifying all the homes, and then climate impacts start getting worse. So you have more people consuming air conditioning load in summer in particular. You want to keep people alive in summer. You want to let people plug their car in at home or have a heat pump. So load on the power grid will definitely go up. I have seen the growth of data centers defended as almost like a training gym, if you could describe it that way, for demand growth. Like, yes, we're going to need demand growth. So data centers are a way to test our ability to build stuff, to build new power generation, build new power lines and batteries. But what we're actually seeing play out is that data centers are competing with requests for new connections. And there's a nice example in Tasmania where there's a paper mill, it actually owned previously by a Norwegian company. That paper mill wants to electrify. They want to switch away from their coal facility on site, and they want to electrify. But they have struggled in a way that a Tasmanian data center did not. And I think that, the narratives, like the political narratives around the story of a new data center or the story of a paper mill plugging into the power grid so it can get rid of coal, they're told in different ways, and they're met with different levels of effort. And so this is really important, right? Like, it is actually really important to be able to grow the size of a power grid and to meet all the demand that's going to be coming down the pipeline. And then it becomes a question for society. Okay, someone's proposing a new data center. Maybe it's worth asking what that data center's for. Like, is it doing, is it storing some amazing system for detecting cancer, like some machine learning tool that detects cancer in scans or something like that, right? Or is it generating 100,000 meta advertising videos, right? This is I definitely don't mean it as like an anti-data center thing, but I mean it more as like, maybe it's time to start asking the question, is this socially critical, particularly at a time when fighting climate change has become, way more critical than it ever has been and will become more critical in the future. So yeah, this is basically the actual material, what do you do part of it. And I think a major part is asking, what is this for? Can you justify it? Explain how this helps us. And Lizzie, you mentioned the community level fights. There's been a bunch of polling in Europe and the US that people really don't like data center developments, particularly when they live near them. And the impression that I get from those polls is simply that people don't know what it's for. It's a building full of computers, and they're like, why should I accept rising power bills or worse air quality or a major change in my local community for something which just absolutely unclear as to what the social benefits are? And you see similar things, right, with different energy developments, like with wind farms and solar farms and transmission lines. So
yeah, I thought it was revealing
that's where we're at.
The COVID Western Eddington, the villain was actually the data center until
that's right.
Everyone got shot. Hey, so sort of to round it out, so COP30 is on at the moment. There is still some hope that Australia hosts COP31 next year. Are these questions being elevated in the big room at the moment, or do you still think it's a side argument?
One of the things that I'm working on, and I hope to have a report finalized next year, is the question of how AI is considered as a tool for climate action, as a climate solution, and that relative to the way that companies are reporting their emissions and talking about their climate impacts. And often what you see is a sort of smushing together of everything. Google will talk about AI in the same breath when they describe a wind forecasting tool that learns from historical forecasts to predict the wind better. In the next breath, they'll talk about Google Gemini or VO3 or whatever, right? Like they talk about these things like they're one technology, but they're really, really discrete technologies. When it comes to COP, there's going to be heaps of instances of this exact problem, right? Where someone will be like, oh, AI is good for climate, but they don't really specify exactly what they mean. And the technologies are so discrete. It's like the difference between EVs and combustion engine cars. even though they're both cars, they both have wildly different societal benefits and uses and problems. And this is an ongoing problem with COP and every climate meeting. And if Australia hosts COP31, I'm sure that it will be a problem at COP31 as well, which is basically that the smushing together of very discrete technologies into one blob. It kind of goes back a bit to what you were saying before, Dan, where it's just, it depends a lot how you treat it. It depends about the boundaries you put on it. And too often we're seeing bad boundaries or bad deployments. And I think that's something that is not really being discussed at these meetings, which I would hope that it would be.
Hey, what a great discussion. Do you guys, what are your reflections, having got all that information out of Ketan's head? It feels to me that I'm not sure if I've got all the answers, but I've got a few more questions, which is interesting. What do you reckon, Dan?
Oh, I'm slightly more terrified about climate change after this conversation than I was before, and I was already pretty terrified. I do wonder that, there are some examples of some Australian data centres which are, at least on the surface, trying to do things, the right way. Green Square DC in WA is one that I'm familiar with, and there's a couple of others over east as well. I just wonder whether there's a role for government I do want to see Australia building more data centres. I hate the fact that all of our data is getting shipped offshore in order to be able to do things, locally that we should have sovereign control over. But I just wonder whether, some more intervention from the government to mandate that, yes, we're going to be a home for data centres, but we're going to be a home for green data centres. And that's just the way we do things in Australia. Kind of like your Danish furniture thing that you go on about, Peter. I wonder if we can be known for green data centres around the world. But,
or Norwegian climate activists as well. Like Lizzie, what about you? What are your reflections after that?
It just reminds me of Dan McQuillan, dare I say it, where he's talking about the problem with AI development is that it's developing within a format that is pre-existing, which favours existing suppliers of power, for example. So every time we talk about this newfangled future and there's promises about it being a climate change solution, that it will be 100% renewable, this development is not occurring in a vacuum on a clean slate. It's occurring within a context that is social political, that is framed by existing vested interests. So I think it, for me, highlights that real conundrum. You might like the tech, but the reality is it is being developed and deployed in a way at the moment that does not have any concern, really, about mitigating climate change, about dealing with growing emissions. And that is a dramatic problem for everybody. So, it's hard to square these things in the here and now, but that's the job I think that we've got.
Yeah. Anyway, it's probably time to clock off. I've got to go and have some yogurt and feel bad about that now too. So,
I gotta go.
But thanks a lot, Ketan. Thanks, Lizzie and Dan. I'll see you in a fortnight, everyone. You've been listening to Burning Platforms. It was recorded on November 13 and produced on Naarm land by Rebecca Connell. Talk again soon.